Today on Unfiltered, we're here in Encinitas, California to talk to fine art landscape photographer Mark Handy. The last time we talked a lot about gear. We talked about cameras, we talked about technology, we talked about the number of megapixels that we need in order to produce the fine art quality images that you produce. I think unless it comes in tangentially, we're going to skip over that today.
Sounds great.
I think today it would be great to talk about inspiration and how you take inspiration and technique into crafting your own images.
It's interesting that you ask about that because I think when most people think of inspiration, they think of looking at other photographers and seeing if they can get inspiration from those photographers and then go out in the field and see if they can somehow replicate the spirit of it, not necessarily the actual shot. But I don't really pay attention to a lot of photographers. In fact, I think if you asked me right now if I knew X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, I probably wouldn't know most of those people. Similarly, they wouldn't know me either. I tended to keep a very low profile. And so when it comes to inspiration, I'm really just trying to better myself each and every time I go out in the field. And sometimes that can be very difficult, especially coming off a really, really successful trip. But the key is to just keep going out there just like a golfer does and just keep trying to do better and better work each and every time you go out there.
Ansel Adams, everybody knows Ansel Adams, right? He's the first guy who took nature and photography and was able to convey emotion. Right. So I think that, through the 1980s until the time of his passing, and then obviously after that until the digital revolution, he sort of stood alone as sort of king on the mountain.
Sure.
And I think there is even a Mount Ansel Adams in the High Sierra named after him.
Right.
So he sort of forged a path on his own. And it sounds as though maybe in some way similarly, if you're not necessarily a fan of other landscape photographers, you're sort of forging your own path.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
When you're out shooting, what are you doing to make a connection to the landscape, to nature? What's your thought process on trying to convey that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something that I think about each and every time I go out in the field. One of the things that you'll notice about me is before I start shooting, I typically walk the landscape itself. I walk the field. I also do a lot of reading before I ever get out in the field so that I understand the history of the area that I'll be shooting. So I have a real appreciation for the geography and the history behind the area that I'll be capturing. And then getting out into the field and again, walking it, smelling the flowers if there are any, walking in the snow, whatever it takes to really get comfortable with the landscape itself, that's what I do.
So you really try and immerse yourself emotionally in it.
Yes, and oftentimes what will happen is instead of just shooting when I get to a location, I'll often not shoot the day of arriving and I'll just scout the area out and then the next day, that's go time.
Interesting. Is that because experientially it's just too fresh for you on the first day?
Yeah, I just think it's too difficult to connect with the landscape if you haven't put any time into the landscape. So that's why the homework, I've seen many shots from these locations at times. Also, I'll do lots of Google searching to see what it looks like from satellite, just to understand the lay of the land, maybe get a topography map and see what kinds of elevation changes I'm going to be confronting. But I'm somewhat familiar with the area, but not fully familiar with the area until I actually get out there myself. And I don't ever anticipate being able to show up to a location and start shooting.
Are you typically surprised when you find that composition, or are you is it a happy accident that you're reaching, or is it constructed?
It's neither. It's neither constructed nor happy. It's one of those things where you know what your general subject is, but you don't know what your composition is at that point. So that's fresh to me. I never go into a scene thinking, oh, I've already got a composition in mind. It's what you're given, and you do your best to compose based on the elements that you have. A good example would be the shot that I posted today. We had not seen the sun in 8 days, maybe 9 days, and we were just happy to see sunlight. But it was really dynamic up on the top of that ridge. Clouds to the left, clouds to the right. And as I saw that unfolding, I recognized that there was a nice composition there. It's that kind of stuff that occurs. I knew that the general mountain range would be in my subject, but I didn't know how exactly it would be composed. And that often happens with me. I'll show up to a scene knowing generally what I'm going to be shooting toward, but not knowing exactly how I'll frame that.
Interesting. So Rob, our cameraman, and I, we spend a lot of time talking philosophically about framing. And you and I in the past have had discussions about perspective. Are there any sort of rules that you either follow or break specifically when it comes to your framing?
I don't typically break rules, frankly. I do kind of stay away from the 50-50 rule. I do like to keep things in thirds. They're good rules.
Yeah.
They make things look more interesting. And when you create conflicts in your images, you're going to have less success conveying what you're trying to convey to your viewer. So here, if you were to do a 50-50 landscape, for example, they're not quite sure what they should be looking at. Am I looking at the sky? Am I looking at the foreground? Just what am I trying to convey to them? And anytime you do that, you've created difficulty for your viewer. So I do stay away from those kinds of things, and I don't break those rules. There are going to be times when I do break a rule or two, but they're not even conscientious. They just happen because my eye sees the composition a certain way, and I like the way it looks.
I always see photographs with lens flare and go, that looks super cool. And then every time I put my camera in my hands, I put the lens shade on, right? So I have this huge collection of images that I've created where there's never a lens flare or there's no, sunball.
Sure.
How do you free yourself from constraints like that mentally? Are there any things where you just go, oh, Mark, just freaking do this,
No, well, I'm glad you mentioned lens flares because that's one of the things I stay away from. The lens flares soften images, as you know. When you're shooting toward the sunlight, your image will be softer from an image quality standpoint than if you were pointing your camera to the left away from the light source. So first, I don't shoot without a lens hood. If the lens came with the lens hood, I use it.
Yeah.
I'll even use it during a cloudy day.
I
It's
use mine
fine.
all the time.
Absolutely
I use it
fine.
inside.
Yeah, it's absolutely fine. The worst thing that can happen to me is being out in the field and not recognizing that the sunlight hit the left side of the lens and bounced toward the sensor and created a flare without me really being able to see it till I get back into the dark room,
right.
or in this case, digital dark room, and you don't see it outside because it's so bright. But then you get home and you see that there's this orange cast that was spread all over your image and it's not usable.
Right.
So I've had that happen. Everybody does have it happen. And the way to avoid that is to not shoot directly toward the sun. That's unless your creative eye just says you want to shoot that direction. I typically don't. There are some images. I recently released an image that does have a flare right over a barn, but I use that to create light and have it splashing over the scene. But typically 99 out of 100 times I will not use a lens flare in my images.
So there was the image you were just referencing was the Palouse?
Yes.
Yeah, where the sunball was setting. And,
Yes.
I mean, that image was spectacular.
Yes.
Were you, speaking of that image specifically, I mean, the sunball is right down the barrel, right?
It's just slightly to the right.
Yeah, but were you anticipating sort of the light rays and everything that were going to happen there?
I knew I get the light rays, but typically I'm willing to sacrifice having those kinds of light rays to have full image quality, integrity in my images. So I'll give up those kinds of things. I think that if you look at most fine art photography at the higher end, you don't see that many lens flares.
Yeah.
Take a look and just notice from here if you see them.
Okay.
I think you'd be maybe surprised to find that most people don't do that.
So that's actually a comment you just made leads me to my next question, which is, what do you see in most fine art photography?
What I see in really good fine art photography is the lack of documentary work. So when I go to a scene, I'm not there to document what happened. I'm there to create art. So I think what happens is a lot of fine art photographers sometimes are in fact documenting what they're seeing out there, and they're not really creating art. And so if you don't get all the way to the art, then you're somewhere in between, and it's probably a fail. And if you don't even get near the artistic point that you're trying to make, then it's a total fail. So for me, I think that's one thing that I do notice when something looks more like a snapshot. That's something that probably was more documentary, and when there's more dynamic skies and the scene feels like it's moving and things like that, that's probably closer to fine art.
So the basics for a landscape photographer. Time of day, is there a magic aperture? Where are you with lenses? Just kind of the 10,000 foot overview.
So you typically will find me pegged to about f10. Most of my lenses show diffraction at f14. The nice thing about Capture One, the software, the latest release, the 2 releases ago actually, have a correction tool now for diffraction. So let's say that I was shooting f16 and I normally wouldn't be there, and so at f16 I would have some softening of that image, but now there's a tool that makes it look a lot more like f10. So you can actually get away with some things. It's something to consider when you're out in the field, for example, knowing that you'd like to be down at f16. Normally you wouldn't be there, but now you can get away with it. It's kind of a little cheat. And I still haven't done that. I'm still shooting at roughly f10. I'm sure that if you look at most of my images from my last trip, you're gonna see that I was at f10 almost on every shot, maybe sometimes f11, but by and large, I hang around f10.
Okay.
My ISO typically is 50, but if I'm in a really windy situation and I need to get ISO up so that I can get my shutter speed up, I'll do that. But typically I like to be at ISO 50, f10, and my shutter speed will vary based on light. As far as when I want to shoot when the light's great. All I care about is quality of light. I don't care if it's noon.
Okay.
I can be in the Palouse and have dappled light with it's just perfect. The landscape has light, shadow, light, shadow. If you only shoot 45 minutes before sunset and roughly 5 minutes, 10 minutes before sunrise and 10 minutes after sunrise, you miss a whole heck of a lot of stuff that's going on. I like to chase light, as I call it.
Yeah.
I'll chase light all day long in the Palouse. My day starts at 3 in the morning because I need to get to my location before sunrise, which is slightly before 5 a.m. in the Palouse. And sunset is just a little before 9 p.m. So I will put in a 7-day period, 2,000 miles on the vehicle. That's a lot of driving, just chasing light and looking for subjects.
Wow.
That is definitely a place to create art. You go to the Palouse, there aren't that many ready-made shots. There are shots that you find based on the light.
In my world, in my head, being a photographer, I can set up a tripod and quite happily stand next to it for 3 hours.
Sure.
And you're a little bit like a sniper on the gun, right? You're on the barrel and you're waiting for that perfect shot. Are you in a similar situation where you're happy to stand next to a tripod for hours?
I've stayed at locations in 10 degree, 0 degree weather for 6 straight hours waiting for the light to be perfect.
And what do you think about when you're standing there?
Well, hopefully I have a friend so that I have someone to speak with. Otherwise, you're just kind of bored, but you're just hoping that you found the comp. That's why you're there.
Yeah.
You're hoping that based on the way since you have a lot of experience, you're hoping that it'll be the way you thought it would be 6 hours before.
Right.
So will you get the conditions that you saw 6 hours previous in your mind's eye? Will you get those 6 hours later?
Right.
It's that kind of stuff. I constantly watch to see how the clouds are shaping up or how that light's looking. It's what you do when you're out there. You have to find something to kill time, and that's exactly what I do.
I find a zen place being there. I kind of zone out a little bit.
Yeah.
I tend to do a couple of things that allow my creative mind to flow, which is I ride my motorcycle, and for some reason being terrified of my motorcycle takes me to a different place. And I also do my photography where I get some quiet time and I let the creative juices flow.
Absolutely.
I will admit to one area in my own photography personally where I find a weakness, which is sometimes I'll go shoot and what I thought I saw on the camera is different than what I see on the screen at home.
Sure.
And I think that there are tools out there like tethering, for example, that can help you mitigate that.
Sure, I agree with that.
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, how confident are you when you're on the gun, you're looking down the barrel, when you're seeing what you're seeing? Do you have a good connection to the final image?
Yeah, I think so. I really don't come home thinking, gosh, I saw it so much differently out in the field and it looks totally different here at home on my desktop. That rarely happens. It typically happens more often when light's dynamic. Things are changing really quickly. And you remember or saw through the viewfinder a certain scene and it didn't quite translate. But by and large, no, that doesn't happen to me. I typically see it through the viewfinder, and when I get home, it looks the same way.
That's why you're a professional photographer and I'm an amateur photographer.
Right? Sure.
I mean, that's one of the things is like you have all of the channels of your creativity and everything's buttoned up.
Sure, yeah.
Right?
Look, a lot of experience, a lot of time behind the camera.
Yeah.
We all make mistakes, but you have to get out there and get rid of those mistakes. You have to learn from those mistakes. You do that early on in your career. The things that I shot early on in my career, I would never show. They're embarrassing.
Yeah.
And if they were out there, I'd actually pull them back in so that no one could tie me to those images.
Right.
It's just the way it is for everybody. We all grow from our images. And so the stuff that I shoot now, almost every shot I take is now a keeper. I think the yield when you first started was like 1%,
right?
If I had to guess. 1 out of 100.
Right.
And I think most people are spraying and praying at that point. But after 5 years, I think that most people who are really good at it are probably 90% yield.
Yeah.
I don't point my camera at just anything. So if I'm pointing, I'll give you a good example. When I was out in Patagonia recently, I noticed that my focus was off slightly in the same exact scene. And then I'd unlock my focus, go back, refocus, and lock it down again. And I saw a couple of those shots in review in post-processing. I was like, yeah, I thought so. Kill those in post. And the next 3 or 4 frames were tack sharp. So you just learn because you know that something's not quite right. When you're looking at it, you can see the little ball inside, the green one inside of your viewfinder, showing you that focus is locked on or off. And when you lock down focus initially, it was locked, and then it got kind of cloudy, and then it started to not be so locked in. You have to be really, really cognizant of all the things that are going on. The scene, what's in your viewfinder, you have to make sure you look outside of that viewfinder because things are often changing right above and you don't even notice it. Those are all trial and error type things. It just takes time.
Do you rely on the tools given to you by the camera, for example, autofocus or something like aperture priority mode?
I do not shoot anything but manual. I've never shot anything but manual, but I do use autofocus. I believe that the camera is better at focusing than I am.
I tend to agree with you, especially this is 80 megapixels. You're shooting 60 megapixel phase 1 XF.
Yes.
And you just can't get in there anymore and really
absolutely
nail it.
If I'm off just a little bit, as soon as I blow those images up to 6 feet wide, all of that softness is spread out through the whole image, and you're just irritated with yourself for trying to lock down focus on your own manually. I would not recommend most people do manual focus on a 60 meg, 80 meg, 100 meg pixel camera.
Are you metering through the lens?
I am using the meter through the lens.
And do you review with the histogram? Is that how you do it?
I live and die by my histogram. I don't even need to see an LCD screen. I don't care what the scene looks like on my camera because it lies. When it's dark outside, things look brighter. When it's bright outside, things look darker.
As much as I love the Phase 1 XF system, and it is the greatest camera this world has ever seen, the little screen on the back doesn't tell the whole story.
No.
Because you open it up on I have a 27-inch monitor, 4K monitor or something, and it's like, bang, this thing is just giving you just a tiny little snapshot.
It's 3.2 inches, and that's pretty good size, but the truth of the matter is that it's just too difficult to view that screen in the field. Again, as you get closer to being dark, that looks bright.
Right.
When you're shooting in a bright scene, things look dark.
Right.
You just can't rely on it. You have to look at your histogram, and you also have to know that your histogram may have a bias, because sometimes when you get, this just comes with, again, more experience, but when you get home, especially when I first got this camera, I'd check to see what my histogram looks like on the back versus what it looks like in my software, and I noticed that it pushed right slightly, which means I'm not going to expose all the way to the right, and maybe I'm going to keep it a little bit to the left. Again, just experience.
Yeah.
But I do live and die by that histogram. That's all I care about.
Yeah. So I'm sort of a jack of all trades with photography. Right? I can do a little street photography. I can do a little landscape. I'm really bad at landscape. I can do product photography. I do my own product photography. And I'm moderately good at everything.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
But not really good at anything.
Sure.
You are excellent at landscape photography.
Yes.
And that seems to be a focus of yours and an expertise of yours. Are there any areas of photography outside of landscape that you could see yourself as an artist pushing into in the future?
I don't think so. I think that I've already gone through that phase. The trial and error that got me to landscape photography. I did the street stuff. I shot cars. I shot people. I shot, you name it, trees in the backyard, rocks. You kind of get it out of your system. You try to figure out what it is you really like about what you're shooting. And it just turned out that I really love landscape photography, and everything else just got pushed aside. And I wanted to be really good at landscape photography, so I knew that I had to specialize, and that's all I could focus on. And that's all I focus on today. I don't shoot anything other than landscapes. My wife cannot get me to do a portrait.
Wow.
I will hire someone to do a portrait.
Right. Wow. That's pretty awesome. And just so the viewers know, you make a living as a fine art photographer.
Yes.
Which means that you are not just taking photographs, you're making fine art. You're printing.
Yes.
Right? Maybe just give us a quick overview of typical size print, average size print, what media you're producing it on,
Sure.
etc.
Sure. So average size, if you look at the history of all of my sales, it's always right around, on average, about 60 inches. Believe it or not, it's kind of odd that it's 60 inches, because I think that's the size at which you could actually use something other than a phase one. I think you can use a Nikon, for example, at 810 and put out some really, really fine prints at 60 inches and less. And so the problem is that it's the outlying stuff that requires the phase.
Gotcha.
Someone wants an 8-foot print. I can't use the Nikon to do that without it making it look soft. And so that's why I went to phase 4 years ago. So average size is about 60 inches on the long side, and our cameras shoot 4:3. So you're looking at roughly, when you break it down, your image is going to be 60 by 45. So that's not exactly a great size for people. You'll typically see me even crop to 3:2 format, so then go 72 inches instead of 60. So it buys me some more space. What else?
And what type of media are you?
So my substrate, I'll start from the back. So let's start from the very back. All of my images, unless you want something different, are on, they're back framed and braced. Depending on how big they are, they're gonna have multiple braces. Substrate is dye bond. The next is going to be the actual paper, which is Fuji Flex. And then the front side will be acrylic. It's 1/4 inch, not an 1/8. There are some photographers out there who have cut corners and they use an 1/8, especially when they're selling a ton of this stuff. It really adds up. But I do use a 1/4 inch thick. Gives it more depth when you're looking through that glass.
Probably keeps it flatter as well.
It does. You start to get flexing after a couple years if you're using an 1/8. It just happens.
Yeah.
Especially if your images are long. What else? What else is there?
That's kind of it. And then looking over the horizon, do you think that well, with Fujiflex, we know that it's archival.
Yes.
Right? Have you looked into, like, for example, the metal prints at all?
Yeah, early on in my career, I looked at metal, but the problem was that clients didn't like the imperfections that would show up on aluminum. And so what happens is you get little dimples. It's just like leather. It's never perfect, right? It's always imperfect. Well, so is metal. You never get a clean roll. And so you get little dimples here, little something here. It's just imperfect to the end user. And they would prefer it not look like that. So I decided not to go that direction.
Cool. Well, thanks for chatting with me today.
You're welcome.
It's been really great. And hopefully we can do this again sometime soon.
We'll do it anytime you want.
Hopefully we can go shoot sometime soon.
The Unfiltered video series is produced by Wine Country Camera, manufacturers of the world's finest filters and filter holder systems. Visit our blog at www.winecountry.camera to learn how to improve your photography by using filters. We've got a ton of great content on the way, so be sure to like our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel.